Last couple of hours have seen a whole series of statements and comments from various officials in the West, in the United States and in Ukraine, which to my mind signal preparations for acknowledgement of the failure of Ukraine's offensive. Let's first of all begin with the most senior official, who is General Mark Milley, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States, America's senior soldier. He's given interviews. He's just given an interview in which he says that the Ukrainians have 30 to 45 days left before the offensive peters out because of the autumn rains and the cold weather, the mud season and the rains and all of that. Now, of course, he's not suggesting that the offensive will have failed by this point. He's not saying that. He's careful not to say that. He seems to be, again, leaving open the option of continuing the offensive after the autumn season ends. And, of course, he accepts that, fighting might continue presumably during the autumn season. He reminds everybody about the slow grind that he predicted about the offensive in earlier comments that he'd made earlier this year. But having said that, having made all those qualifications about Mark Milley's words, I still find it impossible to see his admission that the offensive will start to run out of steam, run down in 30 to 45 days as the autumn weather closes in, as anything other than preparation for the fact that the offensive, to all intents and purposes, has essentially ended. As, again, was said by Scott of Calibrated in that fascinating program that he participated in the new Atlas. Who would have thought at the start of the offensive, this is a program made, who would have thought at the start of the offensive that by the time that program was made, which was on the 1st of September, that Ukraine would still be fighting in the same sort of places that it has been fighting for at the start of the offensive, for villages like Rabotino and Kleshayevka and other villages in other places. That was said on the 1st of September. Today is the 10th of September. We are 10 days beyond Scott of Calibrated's comments then. And of course, we are now, according to Mark Milley, 30 to 45 days from the autumn wet season, the rains, the mud, and all of the rest. And if the Ukrainians have not achieved significant progress in the 3 months since the offensive began, despite all the enormous losses that they have suffered, and if their offensive, as Mark Milley essentially concedes, is going to effectively be put on pause during the autumn rains and mud season, then who realistically supposes that after all of these losses, that after all these losses in equipment, and above all in men, and especially trained men, that Ukraine will be able to resume the offensive thereafter? Anyway, that's Mark Milley. We've also had comments now from other people, from Kirill Budanov, the head of Ukraine's military intelligence, a committed hardliner, an ideological personality par excellence within the Ukrainian military and political hierarchy, the orchestrator of Ukraine's assassination war against Russia, an assassination war which, by the way, has been admitted by The Economist magazine, no less. And I want to say a few things about that shortly. But anyway, Kirill Budanov is now talking about the offensive continuing in the winter. He said, yes, of course, the cold weather, the damp conditions, they will affect the ability to conduct the offensive. But of course, that doesn't mean that the offensive itself will stop. But of course, he is already talking about an offensive dragging on into the winter, whereas just a short time ago, a few months ago, I remember him making predictions about how Ukraine would be in Crimea by the summer. So there we are. So Budanov is now talking about the winter. He's talking, in other words, about an indefinitely long, protracted war. I don't think anybody, again, seriously supposes that the offensive can continue into the winter, but anyway, that's Budanov. So we've also had other comments, and one person who has been highly visible, speaking to all kinds of people, is Trent Moll, who we're told is the senior analyst on Ukraine matters in the Defense Intelligence Agency. Larry Johnson has two very interesting pieces about him. And he's been talking to journalists at Newsweek and at The Economist. And I think people, in my opinion, are not reading fully, accurately, what he's actually saying. Because, of course, his job is to put an optimistic spin on failure. He talks about a realistic possibility that the Ukrainians might break through all the Russian lines by the end of the year. Now that puts us, however, back to the end of the year. So he's not expecting a Ukrainian breakthrough through all the Russian lines before the autumn. And again, let's repeat once more that realistically, the offensive, if it is going to succeed, has to succeed before the autumn, because after the autumn, after all the enormous losses in men and equipment, it's not going to be realistically possible to resume the offensive in the difficult conditions, the weather conditions that exist there, and especially given the scale of the Russian build-up, which is underway. Now, along with saying that, a realistic possibility, which the Daily Telegraph, which has close connections to the British intelligence agencies, I don't think anybody disputes that. The Daily Telegraph has told us that when Mr. Moll talks about a realistic possibility of something happening, he means that that possibility is only 40 to 50%. So even if Ukraine were to be able to conduct the offensive in the autumn and winter, he still thinks it's less than evens, or at least this is what he's saying, that it will be successful at all. And that's, again, something that perhaps people haven't noticed. But then we have this extremely interesting paragraph in the interview he gave to The Economist. He concedes that's to say Mr. Moore, concedes that American and Ukrainian officials failed to appreciate the depth of Russia's defenses and how difficult it would be for Ukraine to smash through them with armour. And let me reiterate again that there have been reports which suggest that the initial expectation was that the Ukrainians would break through the main Russian defence lines with their armour within 8 days. But then he goes on to say, the Economist goes on to say this: Ukrainian generals, and that, by the way, is a reference to General Tarnavsky, have told the Guardian newspaper that 80% of Russia's effort went into building its first and second lines. But Mr. Moll cautions that the bulk of Russia's reinforcements remain at the third line. Now, Mr. Maul is directly contradicting what General Tarnowski said to The Guardian. Of course, he's careful in his choice of words, and notice that General Tarnowski has become generals, plural, rather than a single general, one, who gave that statement to The Guardian. Mr. Maul clearly doesn't agree. He says that the bulk of Russia's reinforcements are at the third line. And of course, the reality is, as Mr. Maul undoubtedly knows, that Ukraine hasn't actually broken through the first line either. So yes, the Ukrainians are still fighting in places like Rabotino, Verbovoye, and those sort of places, but that's not where the bulk of Russian forces are, contrary to what General Tarnowski said. That's not where the greatest effort of the Russians has been focused. The main Russian forces are on the third line. And by the way, I should say that from tracking what's actually been happening in the fighting, certainly around Rabotino and Verbovoye, but indeed elsewhere, Bakhmut and the rest, I would say that is correct. It's deeply misleading to think that large parts of the Russian military have been committed to repelling Ukraine's offensive up to this point. There are perhaps 2 or 3 regiments of Russian troops initially concentrated in the Rabotino-Verbovoye sector. They've been rotated and replaced recently by a force made up of Russian Marines and paratroopers of the 76th Airborne Guards Division. Of course, paratroopers and Marines are not regular infantry, they're not part of the heavy infantry. My overwhelming impression right through has been that the bulk of Russian forces from the 58th Guards Army, one of the most powerful armies in the Russian armed forces, which will of course be made up of tank forces and armoured infantry, that they have not yet been committed to the battle. They're still there, apparently, according to Mr. Maul, on the third line. So far, Ukraine has incurred all these enormous losses, fighting a fraction of the Russian forces in the Zaporozhye area and fighting against more lightly armed troops ahead of the great fortified lines. So that's the reality, and again, it's the one that Mr. Maul is slipping out. Once more, what he's doing is he says, well, look, there might be, there's no realistic prospect of Ukraine breaking through by the autumn, before the start of the rain and mud season in October. That's not going to happen. There is a chance that they might break through by the end of the year, but he puts that at only a realistic chance, in other words, not a fantastical chance. And the Daily Telegraph tells us that that's only a 40 to 50% chance. But probably, deep down, he doesn't even think that, because he tells us that the main Russian forces in this area have not so far been committed. They're well to the south, on the third line of defence. Ukraine hasn't even got past first base at this point. So that's my take on what Mr. Maul is saying. He's preparing us for the fact that there will be no breakthrough by the autumn. He doesn't want people to go around saying that the Ukrainian offensive has failed, nor does Mark Milley, nor does Kirill Budanov. So they're all keeping open this idea that the offensive will continue beyond the autumn and into the winter. But in Mr. Moore's case, one gets the sense when one reads past the more optimistic words that he's floating out, that he doesn't really think that either, because he knows that despite the losses Ukraine has already incurred, they haven't actually fought the bulk of the Russian army yet on the southern front lines where the big breakthrough is supposed to take place. And then there's been one final comment made by yet another Ukrainian official who has told us that the Russian armed forces, the total number of Russian troops committed to the conflict in Ukraine, now a number 420,000 men. Now, I want to stress this is a Ukrainian guesstimate. We don't know to what extent it's true or not, and we've been cautioned by various people that it's a Ukrainian estimate and it might not be correct, but there we go. We're told that Russia has 420,000 men in the theatre, which of course is much more, far larger number of men in the area than we've seen actually committed to the battle up to this point, reinforcing the observation made by Mr. Trent Moore of the Defence Intelligence Agency, that up to this point, the main force of the Russian army has not yet even been committed to the battle. So there we go. It's a situation where it seems to me what we're seeing is in effect an attempt by US and Ukrainian officials to manage expectations, to lower expectations. There's not going to be a breakthrough this summer. There's not going to be a drive through to the Sea of Azov within the next few weeks. There's too many Russian troops there. Most of the troops have not yet been committed to the battle. Russian defences have been too dense and too sophisticated. The minefields have been too dense altogether. But of course, we don't want to say that this whole offensive has outright failed. Admitting that would create a collapse of morale in Ukraine itself, and certainly within the Ukrainian army, which is suffering horrific losses. And of course, it might also weaken support for Ukraine in the United States especially, but also in Europe. So we don't want to say that. So we continue to pretend that the fact that we're not going to achieve this breakthrough by the autumn somehow doesn't matter, because we can continue to fight on through the autumn, the late autumn and winter, and perhaps going on further into the spring. But 420,000 men, if that is the right number of the Russian forces in Ukraine, most of them, as I said, not so far committed. It's probably roughly the same number as the totality of Ukraine's armed forces. The Russians are busy enlisting 400,000 contract troops by the end of the year. A Russian official has said that they don't need an extra mobilization because with these 400,000 combat troops, contract troops, full-time professional soldiers, they can rotate whatever troops on the front lines need to be taken back to the rear for rest and refit. They can continue, in other words, they can maintain a constant number of fresh, well-equipped, fully trained soldiers on the battlefield. And he says that the number of men, contract soldiers in the operational reserves will equal 1 for 1 by the end of the year the number of troops that Russia has in theatre. So on the assumption that the Russians will have 400,000 men called up, contract soldiers by the end of the year, that is an indirect Russian confirmation that the number of Russian troops in theatre now numbers 420,000, the Ukrainian number. So we can see that Russian forces are growing in number, they're strengthening, they're hardening up, and Ukrainian forces, by contrast, have suffered appalling losses and are becoming depleted, and they've not managed to get past first base. And all of these reports, all these comments by US and Ukrainian officials tell us that they know that. And there's been some extraordinary articles. There was an extraordinary article in the London Times which spoke about the scale of Ukrainian losses, and it said that forces in the south fighting around Rabotino expect now to suffer 90% losses, which seems amazing and is surely unsustainable. Now, that might be an exaggeration, but it was what appeared in the London Times, and it comes from a comment that in the Times it speaks as follows: Boyet's unit has already been reduced by casualties to 25% of its original strength since joining counteroffensive operations around the axis towards Rabotino in July. And the life expectancy of storm units is the shortest on the front. 90% of the guys here will die too, added the young fighter matter-of-factly, looking around his comrades as the Scala Battalion stormtroops waited to receive orders for another night attack on Sunday. We know that, sure, we've breached the first line of the Russians. Of course, he means that they managed to enter Rabotino. This was said some weeks ago. Of course, they haven't been able to move past Rabotino, and as I've explained many times, Rabotino is not actually the first line of defense, if by that you mean the Surovikin line. But anyway, coming back to what he says, we know that, sure, we've breached the first line of the Russians, but effing hell, what a cost. And today, more reports, more fighting around Rabotino, more Ukrainian losses. The Russians apparently had controlled all the high ground around Rabotino. Ukrainian troops trying to enter the village suffer appalling losses. Ukrainian troops trying to advance in the fields around Rabotino, again suffering heavy losses. It's the same story now, day after day after day. The whole area has become a kind of grisly killing zone, and we see this continue. and there's been more Ukrainian attacks towards Verbovoye over the last 24 hours. And again, the outcome is the same. More Ukrainian soldiers killed every single day, gaining scarcely any ground, perhaps claiming advances in the open fields of 50 to 100 meters. But these advances, if they're really actually, even properly speaking, advances, it seems to me all that they're doing is that they're taking the Ukrainians deeper into Russian organized killing zones. So that's the reality at the moment. An offensive which US and Ukrainian officials are now preparing us for the fact that it's ended. What they will do is that when the autumn season comes, they will still say that it might be renewed in the late autumn and the winter, and then we will basically stop hearing about it. And that's how, as I said, expectations are being managed. First they're being lowered, and then the news, the story, the discussion of this offensive will gradually ebb away, just as the offensive itself has done. Now, I've previously discussed how there's been talk of negotiations, the difficulties in those negotiations, getting negotiations started, the Western powers unwilling to acknowledge or concede Russian points about the need to look at the security situation in Europe. Certainly, Ukraine's Russian insistence Ukraine can't be part of NATO. It must remain neutral. West is not prepared to discuss that. They're certainly not prepared to discuss the general situation in Europe altogether. And we did on the Duran, there is on the Duran a detailed, very enlightening, if I say so myself, outstanding discussion that we were privileged to have on this topic with Professor John Mearsheimer. You will find it all there, and you will see what he has to say about the fact that negotiations between the Russians and the Americans, or between the Ukrainians and the Russians, that will remotely address any of the issues that the Russians are concerned about, and which might lead the Russians to agree to a conclusion of the war on the basis of a diplomatic outcome, that none of that is going to happen, because in the United States it is inconceivable that people think that. And I'm going to say that not only should you watch that program, but I've also, since that program was made, I've been reading some comments that Larry Johnson has been making on Sonar 21, also about the comments made by Mr. Trent Moore. And I will say this, that Larry Johnson's perspective on Trent Moore's comments is somewhat different from mine. I see them primarily as intended to lower expectations, to tell us that the breakthrough isn't going to happen this autumn, to push talk of a breakthrough back until the end of the year so that it can be forgotten in the meantime, and slipping out admissions about the fact that the bulk of the Russian forces, as I said, have not yet been engaged in the battle at all. But anyway, that's my perspective on Mr. Trent Moore's comments. But Larry Johnson's is different, but I don't think it's diametrically inconsistent with my own. Now, one thing where I think we both agree, Larry Johnson and I, is that Mr. Moore is clearly not talking to the media without authorization from the administration. In fact, it's clear that he's not just authorized by the administration to talk to the media, he is instructed to do so. He is going out, talking to the media, discussing the state of the offensive, very much, as I said, as part of the expectations management exercise that the administration is now undertaking, and which the Ukrainians are now undertaking, in light of the fact that the offensive is now understood to have failed. But Larry Johnson makes a further point, which is this: the big takeaway for me from Moore's interview is that the Biden administration completely discounts the possibility of a Russian battlefield victory and a Ukrainian collapse. If Ukraine does collapse, which I think is likely, we will witness Afghanistan too, which means the United States once again is caught unawares by a rapid deterioration and will scramble desperately to come up with a plan B. By then, it will be too late. And I'm starting to wonder whether perhaps he's right. I've assumed in my recent programs that the administration, one of the reasons the administration wants to talk, is trying to establish some kind of channel of communications to the Russians, is coming up with this idea that the conflict be frozen and Ukraine be given security guarantees in return for, in effect, conceding Russian control of the territories that the Russians currently occupy. One of the reasons, the primary reason why I thought that the administration wants to do that, achieve that outcome, is because they want to avoid a debacle in Ukraine last year, the collapse of Ukraine next year. But what if they don't actually think that Ukraine is at any risk of collapsing next year? What if they think that Ukraine is able to keep fighting on? They probably still want to bring the war to a stop, because the war is becoming increasingly unpopular with some people in the United States. Congress, the Republicans in Congress, especially in the House of Representatives, are becoming increasingly unhappy about authorizing further requests for funding to supply weapons to Ukraine. It's becoming a partisan issue. It might be a difficult issue for the administration to handle during the election. But perhaps they still think that Ukraine, even with fewer weapons, even with less ammunition, even without the supply of tanks, that it can somehow still battle on. The Russians have been much more successful than the administration imagined in terms of the defense. So Ukraine has failed to break through. It's failed to deal out upon the Russians a knockout blow. It looks as if that isn't going to be achieved. And so Joe Biden won't have his great foreign policy victory going into the election next year. The defeat of Russia, the crisis in Moscow, the collapse of the Putin government, which perhaps it was expected. But perhaps the idea is that, we tried to bring this conflict in Ukraine under control. We don't want unexpected surprises, so we try to get the Russians and the Ukrainians to agree to freeze the conflict on the existing lines and give Ukraine the security guarantees, and eventually maintain our plan to get Ukraine into NATO. But perhaps you've got no priority and no desire to think beyond that, because we haven't really woken up to the real risk, the real danger that Ukraine might just collapse completely next year. Because probably, possibly, the US still is taking a lot of its information about losses from Ukraine. They probably still think that the Russians are suffering heavier losses than the Ukrainians are. No one, I think, who studies the information on the battlefields closely and who maintains any degree of critical thought and observation seriously believes that, but much of the Western media says it, and of course the Pentagon still says it. They still put Russian losses as higher than Ukrainian losses. So maybe the administration really does believe that. Maybe it really does believe that the Russians are so run down and so depleted that, yes, they've been able to repel Ukraine's offensive, but there's no real risk, there's no real danger that they will be able to go on the offensive themselves this autumn or winter or perhaps in the spring. And if they do go on the offensive will be a failure, just as the Ukrainian offensive has been. So maybe that is what they think. And if so, I think what Larry Johnson is warning people about, that the collapse, when it comes, will come as a surprise, and that the administration will be scrambling, looking for a plan B, without having prepared for one, and doing so in the middle of an election. Well, I think that starts to look possible. Of course, I don't know what people are saying within the administration, what they're saying in the corridors, in Washington, in the State Department, in the Pentagon. But it does look as if that might be the position, in which case the situation is even more dismal than it had seemed to me before. It's not just that the United States cannot negotiate for ideological reasons, which is essentially what I've been saying, but it cannot negotiate because it is still too complacent to negotiate. It doesn't understand the depth of the crisis that is developing. Now, I've been contacted by the person who was my source about a lot of the things that have been going on within the Wagner organization over the course of the last couple of months. This source has been consistently correct in his analyses, and he has access to information from Russian soldiers dispersed all across the various front lines, not just in the Wagner organization itself, though most of his contacts are from amongst Wagner fighters. Anyway, he's been consistently correct. He tells me about in the past, and well, I can't obviously say that he's going to be absolutely correct from this point on, but this is what he says. Firstly, he says that since the Prigozhin mutiny, and especially since Prigozhin's death, the Wagner organization has been essentially broken up. Many of the Wagner fighters have now signed contracts with the Russian Ministry of Defense and or have been inducted into other Russian private military companies that already have arrangements with the Russian Ministry of Defense. In other words, many Russian Wagner fighters are being absorbed into the Russian military system. And apparently there is still a rump of around 10 to 15,000 fighters left who still form part of the Wagner organization. This source is skeptical whether it will survive. I'm going to make a guess. I think that at some point President Putin is going to revive the idea of maintaining this force as a single unit, but having this unit also absorbed within the Russian military system and taking out a contract with the Russian Ministry of Defense. But anyway, that's what this person has to say about Wagner. But what he says about the overall situation on the battlefronts within Russia is in some ways more interesting. First of all, he is talking about a gigantic increase in Russian drone production. And by the way, Putin has alluded to this himself. He's talked about vast numbers of people being trained to operate drones. And this person gives figures and numbers, and they're eye-watering. I'm not going to repeat them. I don't want to say too much that might disclose a little about this person's identity. But all I will say is he says that there are now 10 factories across Russia that are building drones, and that the Russians are now looking to basically saturate the skies with drones. And interestingly enough, we seem to be talking about many different types of drones. Some of them, like the Sirius and Orion drones, will be similar to some of the drones that the United States operates, the Reapers and the Predators and those sort of things. But the vast majority will be a combination of small surveillance drones like the Orlan 10 and others, which perhaps are going to be more sophisticated, and the various types of kamikaze drones, the big ones, the Uranium 2s, which, by the way, were active in the Kiev region last night, but also smaller drones, these Lancets and the other more sophisticated versions of these kamikaze drones that are used on the battlefields to destroy armoured vehicles and to cause extraordinary degree of devastation, and which have caused an extraordinary degree of devastation to Ukrainian armoured forces. And when I'm speaking about armoured forces, it's been reported now that Challenger 2 tanks are now starting to appear in several places. There have been the 2 Challenger 2s that are claimed by the Russians as destroyed in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area. But apparently Challenger 2s have also appeared on the Vremivka salient area. And it's been pointed out by a number of Russian officials that the fact that Ukraine is now starting to parcel out its tank forces in this way, deploy individual tanks taken out of particular brigades and units, but disperse them piecemeal to different places, is another sign of a Ukrainian army that is becoming overextended and is starting to suffer breakdowns, and which is being obliged to deploy what armour it still has to plug gaps in particular locations. I'll just say. But anyway, the armour, such as it is, that Ukraine still has, going to be effectively attacked by large numbers of drones. And of course the Russians will no doubt also use drones to do something which they were not able to do previously, which is to deploy very large fleets of drones in attacks on Ukrainian urban centres. And I remember reading last year an article in the New York Times which did a lengthy discussion of Russian military operations in Kiev, in and around Kiev, at the start of the special military operation last year. And he pointed out that one particular weakness that the Russians suffered from at that time was a insufficiency of drones, which meant that the Russians weren't fully familiar with all of the locations where the Ukrainians were. They didn't have round-the-clock surveillance of the Ukrainian forces. Well, if and when the Russians do return to Kiev, that problem will no longer exist. And of course, they can also use kamikaze drones, including the bigger ones, as precision attack weapons against fortified Ukrainian positions within these towns, something which they have not done to any extent up to now. So it does seem as if the build-up, the Russian build-up, is immense. The person suggests that morale amongst Russian troops is strong, that they're fairly confident that when they do go on the offensive, they will be able to achieve success. And this person suggests that the offensive, when it comes, will be a major offensive. Perhaps we could see it in two parts: a smaller offensive this autumn and winter, and then a big knockout blow, which he expects will happen around January time. And that this is intended essentially to break Ukraine, to make it impossible for Ukraine to sustain the war. Now, this person also thinks that the point might soon have been reached where the Russian military is prepared to start adopting big arrow offensive tactics, that Ukraine's forces are being so severely depleted and degraded that with a Russian army of about 500,000 men operating across Ukraine, with large reserves at its back, able to replenish and reinforce its forces wherever it needs, and with Russian command and control systems perfected, and drone surveillance systems perfected, and armor tactics perfected, and all of those sorts of things, that the point will finally have been reached when the Russians are able to go back and start engaging the Ukrainians in big arrow offensives again. At least that is what I understand him to say. Anyway, we will see whether that all comes together. But in the meantime, the key takeaway is that these comments that we're seeing from US and Ukrainian officials they look to me like expectations management. They're an attempt to try to move the dial, to tell people, yes, there's not going to be a big breakthrough this autumn, this summer and autumn. Hold out hope, don't give up hope. Something will happen later in the autumn or in the winter. We are not giving up now. But the key thing is to get the offensive itself out of the way without having people in the West talk straightforwardly about its failure. So there we are. Now, I'm not going to say exactly what the Russians are going to do over the course of this year, because I don't know. As I said many times, the Russian General Staff does not share its plans with me. And of course, there's also the question of what the political leadership in Moscow is thinking, and they don't share their plans with me either. I think that the Ukrainian army is not going to be able to go back onto the offensive again anytime soon, and I think it probably could retreat and go onto the defensive, following the advice of people like George Beebe and Jim Webb. But this persistence in launching attacks, this attempt, if you like, to act out the narrative of a Ukrainian offensive, is making that less and less viable and is ultimately playing into the strategies of the Russians. Now, alongside all of this, there's been a whole series of articles which have appeared in all kinds of places about battlefield tactics, about training issues, about how the Russians are getting better all the time in the way that they perform on the battlefields, and how the Ukrainians are, well, they've run into all kinds of problems with battlefield tactics and such things, and that the training that they were provided by the West hasn't really lived up to expectations. Well, there's a long article about all of this in by Simplicius the Thinker, in which he puts all these various articles together and makes all kinds of very interesting comments. I understand that Brian Boletic at the New Atlas is going to look into all of these issues more deeply as well. I'm going to defer any discussion of my own until I've digested these articles and that program by Brian Boletic myself. It's not my area of expertise. I think it is interesting and important. It also points, by the way, to a very, very formidable Russian army coming out of the war. A point made by several people, Professor Mearsheimer, Lieutenant Colonel Davis, others as well. But anyway, as I said, I'm going to defer discussion of that until, as I said, I've seen what others better informed than me and more knowledgeable about these matters than me have to say about it. Meanwhile, the political situation, the geopolitical situation, continues to shift. And the G20 meeting, which I rather discounted as having relatively little importance, it turns out might have considerable importance after all. And the G20 has now indeed published its statement, its joint statement, and it is a very interesting statement indeed, in the sense that what it tells us about the war, what it tells us about the situation in the world, and about the way in which it's essentially failing to use the kind of language that the West wanted it to use, and it's, let's say, that it's gone far below Western expectations. Now, I read the statement. It doesn't actually say very much about Ukraine. It's all tucked away in a single paragraph, paragraph 8, from recollection. It talks about a war in Ukraine, and the Ukrainians apparently weren't happy with that because they thought that an expression of war in Ukraine is frankly not an appropriate way to describe that kind of a war. And it also fails to address in any kind of way the various views, statements that Western leaders have felt about the war. It doesn't make any real claims, any comments that could be in any way taken as seriously criticizing the Russians. What it says is that the nations, the various nations participating in the G20, all maintain their existing positions. That's all that it's prepared to say. It's not prepared to say more than that. And there's no references to aggression. there's no real reference to Russia itself either. There is a reference to the importance of abiding by the principles of the UN Charter with respect to territorial integrity and non-use of force and all of those things. But the Russians, for their part, insist that their actions do not in fact violate the UN Charter, which is presumably why the Russians signed up to this statement. In fact, listening to Lavrov's comments after the G20 statement was made, it's fairly clear that he thinks that the Russians have scored a significant diplomatic victory. The actual words on the statement, I'll just read them out, are as follows. Concerning the war in Ukraine, whilst recalling the discussion in Bali, we reiterated our national positions and resolutions adopted at the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly, and underscored that all states must act in a manner consistent with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter in its entirety. In line with the UN Charter, all states must refrain from the threat or use of force to seek territorial acquisition against the territorial integrity and sovereignty or political independence of any state. The use or threat of use of nuclear weapons is inadmissible. Now, as I said, no mention of Russia, no criticism of Russia, nothing there that the Russians would take any sort of exception to. And there was further statements about the grain deal, and they are, again, interesting. What they say, this is in paragraphs 10 to 11. We highlighted the human suffering and negative added impact of the war in Ukraine, with regard to global food and energy security, supply chains, macro-financial stability, inflation and growth, which has complicated the policy environment for countries, especially developing and least developed countries, which are still recovering from the pandemic and the economic disruption, which has derailed progress towards the SDGs. There were different views and assessments of the situation, which is a way of saying that some countries blame all that's happening, the problems with global food and energy security, supply chains and macro financial stability, upon the West's sanctions policy. And then the statement goes on to say, we appreciate the efforts of Turkey and UN-brokered Istanbul agreements consisting of the Memorandum of Understanding between the Russian Federation and the Secretariat of the United Nations on promoting Russian food products and fertilizers to the world markets, and the initiative on the safe transportation of grain and foodstuffs from Ukrainian ports, Black Sea initiatives, and call for their full, timely and effective implementation to ensure the immediate and unimpeded deliveries of grain, foodstuffs and fertilizer inputs from the Russian Federation and Ukraine. This is necessary to meet the demand in developing and least developed countries, particularly those in Africa. So, note again, Russia is not criticised for its refusal to renew the grain deal. It talks about the full, timely and effective implementation of the grain deal. The Russians say that it was not fully implemented because the sanctions and the obstructions on export of grain, foodstuffs and fertilizer from Russia have never been implemented. Statement doesn't say that that is wrong, and it says that there must be immediate and unimpeded deliveries of grain, foodstuffs and fertilizers inputs from the Russian Federation and Ukraine So Russia, if anything, is given priority. So, again, no criticism of the Russians. The Russians have already signalled that they're perfectly happy about this. And Lavrov has said that the West is still refusing to link Russia's agricultural bank to the SWIFT interbank payment system. He said that the West has come up with some kind of complicated scheme whereby a subsidiary of this bank in Luxembourg is connected to SWIFT instead. He says that's clearly unworkable and unacceptable. It has to be Russian agricultural bank in Russia using a subsidiary in a EU country, Luxembourg, simply isn't going to work. And I would say I would go further than that. I would say the very fact that this proposal to use a subsidiary instead of the actual bank itself is in effect the West saying that they're not prepared to reconnect this particular bank, the Russian agricultural bank, to SWIFT. So it seems as if, again, the Russians have dodged the bullet on that one. They're not being criticised for the fact that the grain deal has collapsed. The blame is, in this statement, being shifted ever so gently towards the West. And there have been some very angry comments about this in the media. Business Insider has talked about how the G20 capitulated to Putin, who wasn't even there. The most measured comments about this are in the Financial Times, and it is to them that to the Financial Times I will turn. G20 leaders have failed to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine in a joint statement after China and Russia rejected language that blamed Moscow for the conflict, highlighting the lack of global consensus in support of Kiev. And the statement, hammered out over weeks of negotiation between diplomats, is a blow to Western countries that spent the past year attempting to convince developing countries to condemn Moscow and support Ukraine. And he points out that the latest statement by the G20 is actually softer than the statement made at the previous meeting in Bali, in Indonesia, last November, and that it doesn't really, in any conceivable way, satisfy not just Western demands, but Ukrainian demands, and that it appears to put Ukraine and Russia at the same level, at the same moral level, which is a position that the West had previously said in the run-up to the G20 summit that it would not accept. And it makes, the Financial Times goes on to make these comments: the deletion of Western criticism of Russia allowed the G20 to find agreement on other issues, such as a pledge to restart exports of Ukrainian grain through the Black Sea. But I've already said how that doesn't really put pressure on the Russians. But anyway, that's what one senior Western official present at the summit said, and he said that compromise was necessary to maintain consensus. The option that we had is text or no text, and I think the right answer is text. You keep the G20 platform and organisation alive. And that's the key. Because, of course, this G20 meeting is taking place a few weeks after the BRICS summit in Johannesburg. And China and Russia are giving increasing amounts of emphasis to the BRICS summit. And the fear the West had was that if they continued to take a strong line at the G20 summit in Delhi and refused to agree a text because they weren't happy with the comments about Ukraine that the Chinese and the Russians would agree to. The entire G20 would just collapse, and the whole of the global south would simply walk away and switch to the BRICS. That's what the Financial Times article is telling us. We see how the development and strengthening of the BRICS is changing the character of the G20. Even at a forum like the G20, which the West has historically dominated, it cannot dominate any longer because it is worried that if it pushes too hard, the whole structure will simply disintegrate and the global south will rally to the BRICS. It is a further indication of the slipping of control that the West has exercised over global politics up to now. And in and of itself, I think this is a momentous move, and I think it also shows that Xi Jinping has in effect dominated events once more at the G20 through the mere exercise in staying away. And there are comments in the Financial Times about this. Hanging over the summit was the still unexplained absence of China's President Xi Jinping. I've already explained it. He didn't want to meet President Biden. There's nothing complicated about that at all. But then it goes on to say, but the wording of the communique still reflected many Chinese talking points, such as that the G20 should limit itself to international economic issues and the language on Ukraine and nuclear weapons. China has also heavily touted its role in supporting African Union membership. And in his address at the summit, Li said, this is the Chinese Prime Minister Li, said that the G20 needed unity instead of division, cooperation instead of confrontation, and inclusion instead of exclusion. The remarks, this is from the Financial Times, are in line with China's portrayal of the United States and its allies as pushing bloc confrontation and engaging in a Cold War mentality. And that is all in the Financial Times. So, China increasingly making the big moves, Russia and India working alongside it. This would not have happened at the Delhi summit if Prime Minister Modi had not been working alongside the Chinese to push the agenda forward in this direction. And I want to stress again that, of course, what the Financial Times calls Chinese talking points are also equally Indian talking points, and they're talking points that both countries have been making for quite a long time and which are articulated and expressed by the BRICS, and which, as we now see from the G20, from this G20 meeting, are attracting global traction. Last but not least, yesterday I devoted a large part of my programme to the situation on the global energy market, the fact that oil prices, energy prices are rising. There's been an interesting and very important article in the Daily Telegraph by Liam Halligan. Liam Halligan is one of the few rational commentators about international economic issues left in the British media nowadays. Anyway, he was one of the first people to make the point at the time when the sanctions imposed on Russia were put into effect last year, that the result would be double-digit inflation in the West. And he's now made similar points about the rise in oil prices, energy prices. He says soaring oil prices are an ominous sign of a new world order. OPEC is increasingly making the most of its unique position as the font of global supplies. And the article then says oil prices are up almost a third over the last 3 months. It is a hugely significant increase that could seriously aggravate Britain's cost of living crisis, and of course it have an effect on the United States as well. Yet this oil price surge seems to have been barely noticed by much of the British political and media class. And he points out that there are some of the recent increases are some of the sharpest monthly fuel price increases in more than 20 years. And he says that all of this is inevitably going to put upward pressure on inflation, and it's going to make it much more difficult for Western central banks to stop their interest rate increases. They've been wanting to stop increasing interest rates. They're worried about the effect on the global economy and on the Western economies of further interest rate increases. But with inflation likely to go on growing, this is not perhaps a fully practical option. By the way, I'm not entirely sure about that. I think the point will eventually come when Western central banks will throw in the towel and they will say that they can't increase interest rates any further. And if that means higher inflation, well, there really isn't any other way out. And he mentions that there is talk among oil traders that the global economy remains some 1.5 million barrels a day undersupplied through September, with future markets pointing to a further 5% price gain by the end of the year. And the market could rally towards the highly symbolic $100 a barrel barrier, a benchmark last reached during the aftermath of Moscow's invasion of Ukraine 19 months ago, despite global growth remaining lackluster. And it seems to me that the fact that there is now what looks like a permanent supply issue means that energy prices are going to remain high in the indefinite future, because they are, if energy prices are as depressed as they are now, when as elevated as they are now, despite global economic growth being, to put it mildly, subdued, then how can we realistically see an increase in growth when the only effect of that will be still higher energy prices, which will inevitably pressure growth back downwards again? Whether we like the fact or not, we are now in an era of stagflation, and that seems to me the future for at least the medium term. And once more, let me reiterate that all of this owes its origins to that disastrous decision to launch an energy war at the start of last year, an energy war against the world's biggest energy producer and supplier, which is, of course, Russia. And that has created permanent disruption in supply chains and a permanent disruption of supply. That, of course, combined with the US administration's feckless depletion of US reserves in order to try to keep oil prices lower throughout 2022 and going on into this year. So there we go. An attempt now, as I said, to acknowledge that the offensive is about to fail, try to move the dial of discussion onto other topics, possible, likely preparations underway for a big Russian offensive, and a world trapped in stagflation. A dismal legacy brought about by a series of disastrous decisions over the last 10 years. How much simpler and neater and better things might have been had the Minsk Accords been implemented. But anyway, that's a discussion for another day. I will finish my programme today at this point. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programmes on our other platforms, Locals, Rumble, primarily. Look us out on Twitter, where I will be returning shortly. And in the meantime, you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. You can also check out our shop and find yourself the amazing things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to check your subscription to this channel and to tick the like button. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day, and well, we'll see what happens in the battlefields in Ukraine over the next few days.